대표인데요. 데니얼 킴 선생님은 지금 브라운대학교에 재직하고 계시고 주로 아시안 아메리칸 스터디즈나 아프리칸 아메리칸 스터디즈 연구 쪽을 많이 해오셨고 또 가장 최근에는 인티머시 소프 콘플릭트라고 해서 한국전쟁의 컬처럴 메모리, 문화기억이라고 하는 주제로 바로 2년 전에 책을 내셨습니다. 데니얼 킴 선생님의 발표는 한국어로 번역이 되어서 자료집에 실려 있고요. 발표는 영어로 진행을 해주시는 것으로 알고 있습니다. 그러면 데니얼 킴 선생님, 발표 부탁드리겠습니다.
안녕하세요. 미안해요. So I will be speaking in English. But first I would like to thank Professor Kim Rothschild for inviting me. I'm very honored to be here. So I will just be reading my paper, which is close to what I said earlier that you have translated, but there's some differences too. So I will just start. Richard Kim's The Martyred was the first novel about the Korean War by a Korean-American author to be published in the United States. While it has to a certain degree languished in obscurity, it was both a popular and critical success when it appeared in print for the first time in 1965. Its author's biography suggests the complex role that Christianity, the novel's central theme, played not only in the Korean War, but in the modern history of the peninsula. Kim was born in 1932 in Hamhung, which is now part of North Korea, an area that had been home to a thriving Protestant community. When the communists came to power, they targeted families like the Kims, who were both landowners and Christians. His grandfather, a minister, was arrested and executed during the war. Kim himself was forcibly conscripted into the North Korean army, but he was able to escape and join the South Korean army, serving as a liaison officer to U.S. military forces. He emigrated to the United States in 1954 and began writing The Martyred, his first novel, in the early 1960s while at the University of Iowa's Writers' Workshop. Given this background, readers might expect, given this background, readers might be surprised to find that this work, while by no means pro-communist, actually offers a deeply critical perspective on the religion of his family. At the same time, The Martyred also expresses a deep sense of compassion for ordinary Christians, and the novel's illuminating power stems from its highlighting of the central place that religion has occupied in the history of the two Koreas. Appropriately, Kim's rendering of Christianity in the novel does not simply reduce it to a tool of Western imperialism. For the astonishing rapidity of that religion's growth in Korea during the late 19th and early 20th century stemmed from the progressive alternative it offered, first to the Neo-Confucianism of the Chosun region that ruled Korea for more than 500 years, and then to the colonial order that was imposed by the Japanese. As historian James Huntley Grayson asserts, Protestant missionaries consciously thought to create amongst Koreans, quote, a self-propagating, self-governing, and self-supporting church that promoted the association of Christianity with the progressive West, and they thus placed responsibility on local Christians for the growth and support of their churches, end quote. The Korean church was then very much a native creation, and it played a key role in the emergence of the anti-colonialist nationalism that emerged during the colonial era. The complex critique of Christianity in The Martyred, however, targets a later version of the religion, one that was intimately tied to the repressive governments that took shape in the South during and after the Korean War. The Martyred centers on a fictionalized instantiation of the storied cruelty of the North Korean regime, the execution of 12 Christian ministers. Its protagonist and narrator is Captain Lee, a military intelligence officer tasked with investigating the circumstances surrounding this massacre, and the work unfolds as a detective novel of sorts. It mostly takes place in Pyongyang during the final months of 1950, when the war of rollback, initiated by UN forces as they crossed the 38th parallel, seemed on the brink of reunifying the country. It ends with its protagonist leaving that city as North Korean and Chinese forces are about to unleash the massive counterattack that would soon bring the war to a stalemate. While The Martyred is certainly a Korean War novel, it does not contain a single battle scene, nor does it offer much explicit commentary on the conflict itself. Rather, its focus is on a more intimate drama that involves the Christian community in Pyongyang during what was for them a brief lull in the fighting. As we shall see, the Martyred is at its core a theological or philosophical novel that grapples with questions of religious faith within the context of war, and doesn't seem at first glance to be particularly interested in history. As Susan Choi puts it, the Martyred is no more about the Korean War than Antigone is about the Civil War in Thebes. The work of art need not be about anything because it is about everything. In The Martyred, Kim forges a drama of such devastating universality that an electrifying sense of recognition binds us to the page. End quote. The novel's universal literary ambitions are also signaled by the dedication, which reads, quote, "To the memory of Albert Camus, whose insights into a strange form of love overcame for me the nihilism of the trenches and bunkers of Korea," end quote. Much like Chang Wei Lee's Surrender, Kim's novel initially seems resistant to more historically oriented critical approaches. Nonetheless, we can begin to see how the Martyred does engage history in subtle and understated ways if we resist placing it at an Olympian distance from the war that provides the setting. And more importantly, if we consider, as the novel encourages us to do, not only the theological aspects of its treatment of Christianity, but also the role that religion played in fortifying the repressive state that emerged during the Korean War in the South. The war crime that lies at the heart of the Martyred is the execution of 12 Korean ministers by communist soldiers. By giving such a prominent place to a massacre of Christians by communists, the Martyred echoes a foundational source of South Korean hostility toward the North, the atrocities committed by the Kim regime against its religious community. It is undeniable that Christian Koreans who lived in the north of the country, which had been a stronghold of the religion on the peninsula, had been the object of a repressive campaign launched by Kim Il-sung shortly after he assumed power. Bruce Cummings notes that between 1945 and 1950, the communists, quote, "eliminated all non-leftist political opposition with a draconian thoroughness, and Christians were particular targets of the regime," end quote. The program of land reform Kim instituted seized property from wealthy Koreans, many of whom were Christians, and his government also made it illegal for churches to own property and nationalized all Christian schools. Church leaders who opposed him were jailed, and Christian rallies and revivals were violently broken up by vigilantes aligned with the government. One reason why this legacy of anti-Christian oppression is so well known in the South has to do with the veritable exodus it generated. The estimates cited by historian Timothy Lee suggest that of the 1 to 1.3 million Koreans who fled the North between 1945 and 1953, 70,000 to 80,000 were Christian. Quote, Northern evangelical refugees, Lee asserts, became a force to reckon with in the South, responsible for 90% of the 2,000 or so churches that were established in 1950. These new arrivals, quote, assiduously espoused their anti-communist sentiments, widening and deepening a sentiment that had already found a home among the Southerners, end quote. Unsurprisingly, there is no mystery in the novel about who executed the 12 ministers, for of course it was the communists. Instead, the initial question that Captain Lee, the protagonist and narrator of the novel, seeks to answer is whether the two surviving clergymen, Mr. Shin, an respected elder, and the much younger Han, were collaborators, which would explain why they had been allowed to survive. Mr. Shin brings the investigation quickly to an end when he confesses that he betrayed the others and exonerates Han, who has gone insane as a result of his ordeal. Shin's testimony initially makes of him a pariah, and an angry mob descends on the residence where he is staying at one point, mocking him with cries of Judas. The frightened Han flees from the house, is overtaken by members of the mob, and beaten to death. The Christian community re-embraces Shin, however, after he narrates a version of events that depicts the 12 as steadfast in their faith and lionizes their eldest member, Reverend Hart, for his inspirational leadership. Shin graphically describes the 7 days of torture to which they were subjected and insists that all of them, except for himself, remained firm in their belief. Their final words to him were, he asserts, a prayer of forgiveness and an exhortation for his community to remember them as devout Christians. After presenting himself as a repentant sinner, Shin assumes the leadership role that had formerly been Reverend Hart's. He mounts a number of revivals during which he continues to embroider the myth of the 12 martyrs, and for the rest of the novel devotes himself to serving the Christians of Pyongyang. We soon learn, however, that Shin is promoting a false narrative. Colonel Chang's soldiers have captured and interrogated a North Korean officer who reveals what the minister's final moments were actually like. Quote, "Gives me great pleasure to tell you that your great heroes and martyrs died like dogs whimpering, whining, wailing. It pleased me to hear them beg for mercy, to hear them denounce their God and one another. They died like dogs, do you hear? Ah, I should have shot them all." The North Korean also reveals that Shin was spared not because he was a collaborator, but because, quote, "he was the only one who put up a fight. I like a good fight. He had guts," end quote. Han, the other survivor, was left alive simply because he had gone insane. In light of this revolution, the central mystery of the novel shifts quickly to the question of why Mr. Shin promotes a fabricated version of those events, casting himself in the Judas role and masking the treason and the apostasy of several others. At one level, the highly charged relationship that develops between Lee and Shin pivots around a philosophical or theological debate over the relevance and meaning of Christianity in a world where torture and the execution of civilians, not to mention the horrors of conventional warfare, are commonplace. Lee is a rationalist and atheist and looks at things with a skeptic's eye. At one point he insists, quote, "Truth cannot be bribed," end quote. Shin would appear to be Lee's antithesis, a Christian who relates a version of events he knows to be untrue because, as he puts it early on, it expresses, quote, "the truth of my faith," end quote. In several pivotal moments, Lee confronts Shin with versions of this question. Your God, is he aware of the suffering of his people? End quote. Shin doesn't ever really answer, but it's clear that the question haunts him. The intensity of the bond between the two men and the centrality of that question to it is noticed by Chaplain Ko, a third character who is friends with both. Through much of the novel's 41 chapters, Lee and the reader perceive Park as engaged in a monumental, Job-like struggle to reconcile his belief in God with his acute awareness of the immense suffering that has befallen so many innocents during the war. He seems further burdened by the knowledge that the martyred ministers were unable to maintain their faith as they faced death. What readers ultimately learn, however, is that Park's anguish actually stems from the fact that he is an unbeliever himself, that he is thus unable to take comfort in the religious beliefs he uses to ease the burdens of others. Park's own apostasy is revealed late in the novel, in the 31st chapter, which takes place in December, days before Pyongyang is to be retaken by North Korean and Chinese forces. By that point, Lee and Park's bond has deepened into a strange friendship. Lee warns Shin of the impending attack and the fact that UN forces will not defend the city, but the minister insists on staying nonetheless. Soon thereafter, Shin falls ill with the flu and Lee tends to him. Shortly after that, Lee too succumbs to the flu and Shin returns the captain's gesture. During Lee's convalescence, Shin makes an astonishing confession, quote, "All my life I have searched for God, Captain," he whispered, "but I found only man with all his sufferings and death, inexorable death. And after death, nothing," he whispered, "nothing." The searing anguish in his pale face was overwhelming, end quote. Shin's earlier enigmatic reactions to Lee's angry skepticism are revealed here as a tacit expression of an atheism that the two men actually share, a kindred belief in God's irrelevance in a world where atrocities are an everyday occurrence. What has thus fueled Shin's efforts at ministering to these suffering civilians is not his belief in God, but his awareness of their dire need for the comfort that only religion can provide, even if he himself no longer believes in it. He insists on giving his congregants, quote, "the illusion of hope," end quote, lest they succumb to despair. He tells Captain Lee, quote, "We must fight despair, we must destroy it, and not let the sickness of despair corrupt the life of man and reduce him to a mere scarecrow," end quote. Shin's confessions reveal him to be the novel's actual namesake, though he is a curious kind of martyr. He believes that there is no God and no afterlife, that the suffering that men endure on earth has no larger divine meaning, yet he professes those beliefs to those who have suffered from the indiscriminate violence of war. And looking at the stricken multitudes around him, he seeks to provide them a solace he can no longer take for himself. fostering a faith in them he no longer shares. As Pyongyang is overrun, Shin makes the ultimate sacrifice, choosing to stay and minister to those who are too weak, sick, old, or young to flee. While the novel offers no definitive account of his fate, the most reliable account suggests that he died of tuberculosis or was executed by the communists. His status as martyr is thus cemented by these rumors, which correctly point to his selfless sacrifice but do not reveal the truth of his atheism. This, then, is the novel's rendering of what a true martyr is, a non-believer who maintains the fictions of religious belief for the sake of others who would fall into the abyss of despair if bereft of the illusion of hope that Christianity provides. Ironically, it is the secret apostate Shin who best exemplifies the core ideals cherished by the religion he no longer believes in: mercy, charity, and sacrifice. Despite the fact that the martyr issues from an avowedly atheistic perspective, it does not seem quite right to describe it as an anti-Christian work. For one thing, the few devout characters who actually appear in the novel are depicted sympathetically. The suffering civilians and Shin ministers who are presented as objects of pathos, not ridicule, and the military chaplain Ko as an earnest man of faith, flawed but essentially sincere in his desire to ease the suffering of refugees. The novel's anger is directed elsewhere, and we can detect its target in Captain Lee's memory of a moment from earlier in the war. He had been a part of a detachment of soldiers searching for hundreds of political prisoners who had been buried alive in a cave by the communists. After hours of work digging in the dirt, he had unexpectedly come across a survivor. With a shiver, I stood dazed in darkness, nauseated by the hellish stench of decomposition and excrement, aware of faint groans and a whimpering that seemed no longer human. Something touched my arm. In a frenzy, I seized it, a human hand, almost skeletal, and edged toward the opening and out into the world, pulling, carrying, dragging a man. End quote. Lee is shocked by the sight of this man, but they are soon surrounded by photographers, Korean and foreign, radio announcers clutching their microphones. He recalls that, quote, "A strange, terrible shame seized me, and I crouched over the man, staring into the limbo of his leaden eyes, as if trying to shield with my body the mute dignity of his suffering from the nonchalant, prying eyes behind the cameras," end quote. And one photographer asked him to move so that he could get a better shot, and another physically pushed him aside, and he became, quote, "blind with rage. I grabbed the shovel and began smashing the cameras, chasing those cold eyes from my man." Notably, the objects of Lee's anger are not the communists who had buried this man and his cohort alive, but the photographers and their implacable nonchalance in seeking to publicize communist atrocities. What fuels Lee's shameful, affected impulse toward the survivor and then his rage is an awareness that this man's horrific experiences will be incorporated into anti-communist propaganda. The hundreds who died in that cave, like the 12 ministers, will be turned into martyrs. The complexities of their suffering flattened into myth, to propagandistic use by the Rhee government. It is in such moments that a point of critique of the South Korean state and the instrumental use it makes of Christianity can be disinterred, as it were, from the novel's theological trappings. This critique is voiced more directly in the novel by Colonel Chang, Captain Lee's cynical commanding officer, who observes, quote, "The 12 martyrs are a great symbol. They're a symbol of the suffering Christians and their eventual spiritual triumph. We mustn't let the martyrs down. We must let everyone witness their spiritual victory over the Reds," end quote. Chang also highlights the political forces that have a vested interest in maintaining the fiction of the 12 ministers' devout heroism. Quote, "Christians in this country are quite influential these days," he said with a faint smile. Then, after a pause, he continued with an undisguised tone of acidity, "Everyone seems to be Christian nowadays. It seems fashionable to be one, from the president, cabinet ministers, generals, colonels, all the way down to privates. Why, even the army has to have Christian chaplains just to feed the American advisors," end quote. While the novel does not flesh out Chang's comments more fully, the statement makes clear that Christians have become dominant in the South Korean government and military, and that their interests are served by any narrative that helps unify the Koreans in the South against the North Koreans, and that satisfies American advisors. Colonel Chang's sentiments are affirmed and fleshed out by Chung-Shin Park's historical study of Protestantism and politics in Korea. Park documents as Syngman Rhee, the first president, a Christian himself, made canny use of that religion as he built a government that was only nominally democratic, that instead, quote, subjugated the legislative and judicial branches to the executive, placed local government under centralized power, and suppressed the free and responsible press with the police and the army, end quote. Especially pertinent to the massacre that plays such a central role in the Martyred is Park's observation that, quote, the persecution of Christians in the North redounded to the Rhee regime's advantage, creating in the South an atmosphere in which anti-communism was upheld as a patriotic ideology befitting a loyal citizen of the Republic of Korea. This atmosphere was strengthened by the numerous refugees from the North, end quote. Under Rhee, the relationship between the South Korean government and the Protestant Church became, according to Park, not only amicable, but symbiotic. Christian leaders and Rhee developed in concert an enduring political formula. Communism is anti-Christian, and hence Christianity is anti-communist. Thus, Christianity and the anti-communist political position were practically fused into one. Richard Kim's exceedingly dim view of both Rhee's and Park Chung-hee's regimes is apparent in an essay titled Oh My Korea, which appeared in the Atlantic Monthly in 1966, 2 years after the publication of the novel. In this essay, Kim recounts the visit he made to his homeland in the summer of 1965, 4 years after a coup led by General Park Chung-hee had toppled the prior government, and 2 years after Park was elected as South Korea's third president. This essay delivers a scathing critique of the anti-communism of Park's and Rhee's regimes and an ideology that had been, quote, solidly elevated into a rather dubious kind of raison d'etre of the nation itself. And Kim goes on to write, the country has been on a constant wartime basis, and it's a revocable anti-communist position with a witch hunt campaign, and always the specter of renewed fighting seems to have created a state of tension, which has been manipulated by Korean regimes in their effort to sustain a semblance of national unity and to consolidate their political power. Reading Oh My Korea alongside the Martyred highlights the critique of anti-communism that Kim forwards in both works. The more overtly political dimension of the novel can easily be overshadowed by its existentialist trappings and its philosophical and theological musings. While The Martyred is hardly a radical novel, its politics veer less to the right than we might expect given the author's family history. Despite the massacre at its center, it simply does not read like an anti-communist read. And while Kim never entertains the possibility that those who fought for the North may have had legitimate motivations, neither does it insist that those who fought for the South were any better. The ultimate indistinguishability of the two sides is powerfully conveyed in a letter that Lee received from his friend Park, in which he relates the first hand-to-hand combat he had been involved in. After his commanding officer was killed, he was put in charge of a unit that engaged the enemy in a bayonet fight. He writes, quote, that somehow everything got all mixed up and it was wild. The trouble was that it was pitch black night and that we all spoke Korean. Devil only knew which side we were killing. Everyone was shouting in the same language, who are you, who are you? For a while the bewilderment was simply staggering. Then something, panic, terror, you name it, snapped and everyone was killing everyone else, end quote. This is the closest to a battle scene for the Martyred ever comes, suggesting that as far as the actual fighting is concerned, this is all that needs to be said. That at its heart, it was a fratricide civil war between combatants who were essentially indistinguishable. To put this differently, the war is presented in this novel as less the outcome of the North's perfidy, an illegal invasion orchestrated by Stalin and enacted by Kim Il-sung's puppet regime, the official anti-communist narrative that reigned throughout the Cold War in the South, and more as an evil tragedy that befell the Korean people. To this extent, it anticipates an aspect of this Cold War narrative of the conflict that emerged after the end of the military dictatorship era, which is brilliantly anatomized by Sheila Mayoshi-Jagger and Jill Kim in their essay, The Korean War After the Cold War, commemorating the armistice agreement in South Korea. For what the Martyred affirms above and beyond is, for above and beyond all, is the, quote, strange form of love, end quote, that takes shape between its protagonists and the masses of civilian refugees who were caught in the crossfire of the fighting. In the end, Kim's novel simply assumes communism's illegitimacy while also leveling a devastating critique of the Christianity that was implicitly and explicitly invoked in American contemporary narratives about the meaning of the war. What the novel ultimately affirms is the bond that emerges between its primary characters, all of whom are, in a sense, ideological orphans, who recognize the fictive nature of the political myths promoted by communism and Christianity, and the visions of nationalism that each promotes. But the novel does conclude on a surprising and tentative note of hope. In the final chapter, Lee pays a visit to Mr. Ko, the former military chaplain who is now simply working at a refugee camp on an island near Busan. In the last scene of the martyr, Lee listens as Ko leads a congregation in prayer, moved by their sentiments but still a stranger to their faith. As he walks away from the search, however, he finds another group of refugees, and with them he finds himself able, for the very first time in the entire novel, to lose himself in a sense of fellowship. Quote, I walked away from the church, past the rows of tents where silent suffering gnawed at the hearts of people, my people, and headed toward the beach, which faced the open sea. There, a group of refugees gathered under the starry dome of the night sky were humming in unison a song of homage to their homeland. And with a wondrous lightness of heart, hitherto unknown to me, I joined them. The only other moment in the novel when Lee experiences a similar sense of softening was in the conversation in which Shin revealed his atheism, and in sharing his struggle prompted the captain to a similar sense of grief over the fate that had befallen his countrymen. Quote, and for the first time since the war, I abandoned myself to uncontrollable tears, my contrition, for my parents, for my countrymen, and for those many unknown souls I had destroyed. The critic Josephine Park has pointed out that the novel's concluding image evokes the author's own emigration, for the same open sea that the fictional Captain Lee ponders the one that Richard Kim himself crossed when he left for the United States in 1954, where he would eventually become a novelist. Park and fellow critic Christine Hong highlight the American allegiances that are apparent from the author's life trajectory. He eventually became a U.S. citizen, and they're also detectable in this novel. While these interpretations are certainly valid, it is a different aspect of this ending that I'd like to emphasize in closing. For what is most significant about this moment, from my perspective, is not the protagonist's movement toward the open sea, but rather the, quote, wondrous lightness of heart, end quote, he experiences, which is elicited not so much by the prospect of emigration, but by the unnamed song that draws him into a sense of fellowship with the refugees, a song that is wordless and that they are all humming in unison, but one that nonetheless pays homage to their homeland. What they're singing is actually immaterial, even if it is the South Korean national anthem, and we never know actually what the song is. Because they are not singing lyrics. Instead, they are humming in unison, voicing a melody that is thus purely musical and non-representational. It is, in other words, a purely figural feeling of national connection that this passage evokes, one not expressible in language, but only through a melody that is carried wordlessly and collectively. That the novel ends this way suggests it is valorizing a desire for a nation that is essentially utopian. It can only be located in an elsewhere that does not inhere in any existing linguistic location or in any existing political state. This utopian nationalist desire might credibly be thought of as apolitical, but I would propose that we think of it as anti-political. If the martyr moves beyond nihilism, it is toward the expression of, quote, a strange form of love, end quote, whose ultimate object is the nation. For the sentiment expressed in the novel's conclusion is an echo of that which is found in the epigraph that opens it, a passage from Friedrich Holderlin's The Death of the Empedocles. Quote, and openly I pledge my heart to the brave and suffering land, and often in the consecrated night, I promise to love her faithfully until death, unafraid with her heavy burden of fatality, and never to despise a single one of her enigmas. Thus did I join myself to her for the mortal accord. the novel opposes to the versions of nationalism promoted by both of the Korean states is a sentimental nationalism that can only be figured as affect and desire, as an ethical connection to others that does not involve making the belief of others conform to one's own, say, Christianity or communism, that affirms an allegiance to those others nonetheless. The name that the martyr gives to the larger collective entity to which it pledges allegiance is ostensibly nation, or Korea, but let us sample the phrases and metaphors that the novel uses as substitutes for these words. In the epigraph, which is taken from Holderlin, the speaker pledges his heart, quote, to the grave and suffering land, end quote. And the emotional awakening he experiences after hearing Shin's confession of atheism is described this way, quote, and for the first time since the war, I abandoned myself to uncontrollable tears, my contritions for my parents, for my countrymen, for those many unknown souls I had destroyed, end quote. While it is clear that the Korean nation that is at some level the reference point of such passages, when they and the novel as a whole gives expression to, there's a patria amor that refuses to identify that object of that love with a more specific name, say the Republic of Korea or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or even Korea. If nationalism too is rendered here as a strange form of love, it is depicted in terms that seek to estrange readers from any sentimental attachment to the versions of nationalism that existing political formation has been built around. This, then, is the specific way in which The Martyred functions as an anti-political novel. It evokes and celebrates a form of nationalist intimacy that has not been incarnated by any existing political regime. And it is thus fitting to end our analysis of the novel simply by repeating its final words. There, a group of refugees gathered under the starry dome of the night sky were humming a song of homage to their homeland, and with a wondrous lightness of heart hitherto unknown to me, I joined them. That's it. Thank you. 감사합니다.
네, 감사합니다. 그 재미교포로서는 처음으로 이제 한국전쟁에 대해서 쓴 소설 순교자에 대한 흥미로운 분석이었습니다. 그것이 남한 정부가 이제 기독교를 어떻게 도구적으로 활용하는 데 대한 논의와 관련해서 겹쳐서 분석해 주셨습니다. 여기에 이어서 여기에 대한 토론을 듣도록 하겠는데요. 토론은 부산대학교 이선희 선생님께서 맡아주셨습니다. 이선희 선생님은 이제 상호교차성이라고 하는 역사를 갖고 계시고 제가 조사한 바로는 소수민족 문학에 좀 관심이 많으시더라고요. 미리 조사를 해봤었고요. 네, 여러 그 논문을 발표하셨습니다. 여성적 글쓰기로 성집에 담는 정복하기라든가 시녀 이야기 분석하셨군요. 굉장히 많은 작업을 해주시고 계신데요. 이선희 선생님께서 이제 토론도 해주시고 그 다음에 거기에 대해서 다니엘 김 선생님이 답변을 해주시면 그걸 또 한국어로도 요약해서 올려주시는 굉장히 여러 역할을 맡아주시겠습니다. 네, 부탁드립니다.
Well, it's quite strange to discuss with the presenter behind. 맞아요. 제 등 뒤에 발표자 선생님 이렇게 두고 토론을 하는 게 굉장히 저는 지금 어색합니다. Dr. Kim, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I will begin my discussion. I'd like to first thank you for giving me this opportunity to read Richard Kim's The Martyred again, and for your great presentation. You have convincingly demonstrated how the novel's theological and philosophical concerns are intricately intertwined with his political and historical ones. I'm convinced by your argument mostly, but I have 3 questions for further explanation and clarification. Well, I'm gonna skip the 3rd one because I think it's a minor one. 세 번째 질문은 토론지의 세 번째 질문은 생략을 하도록 하겠습니다. To better understand your reading of the novel, I'd like to first ask what motivated you to do this research. Earlier in the paper, you mentioned that it is, quote, a kind of historiographical project, unquote. I wonder if this paper is a part of a larger project you are working on. If so, could you please tell us a little bit about the larger project and how does Kim's novel tie into that project? My second question is about the unexpected or expected ramifications that Minister Shin's false testimony that glorifies the 12 ministers into martyrs. At a church service, Shin tells a lie that they died martyrs, not because he truly believes in God, but because he believes that a religion, specifically Christianity, can at least provide people with, quote, the illusion of hope, unquote, which is what they need in fighting against despair. Fully aware of the absurdity of the human condition encapsulated in Captain Lee's question for Shin, Shin risks self-deception in order to help his fellow people greatly suffering from the war. Shin's act, however, is, I think, exactly what Colonel Jang expects him to do. That is, Shin's mythologization functions as the very anti-communist propaganda planned by Jang. Shin ironically serves the South Korea's political interest, which is to strengthen anti-communist sentiment among Christians in Pyongyang. Even though Shin stays in Pyongyang to care for refugees and those who are not able to leave while the South Korean army abandons the city, it seems that it is difficult to distinguish his martyrdom from that of the 12 ministers in that both forms could be easily used by the South Korean army and Syngman Rhee's government, represented by Colonel Jang, who says that, quote, "We do what we have to do for our country," unquote. In chapter 27 of the novel, for example, the memorial service becomes the place where the martyrs remind Christians of how they have been persecuted by the Reds and thus reinforce their shared feeling against communism. Likewise, in chapter 35, the portraits of the martyrs are used in an organized demonstration against the Chinese intervention. And Shin does not seem enraged by the fact that the South Korean army is sneaking out while civilians are left with the exploded bridge. Well, to sum up, my question is, what you think about my opinion that Shin's act of faith can be manipulated for anti-communist propagandistic purposes upon which the South Korea's governments have depended for their political power. My last question is about your suggestion that the, quote, sum up homage to their homeland, unquote, that conveys a, quote, utopian nationalist desire, quote, is anti-political. I found that idea really interesting and would like to hear more about it. In relation to this idea, you propose the term, quote, sentimental nationalism that can only be figured as affect and desire, unquote. I was wondering whether it is possible to clearly distinguish the sentimental nationalism from what you call, quote, the versions of nationalism that existing political formations have been built around, unquote, considering that nationalism always involves affect and desire. I also think that this anti-political sentimental nationalism itself can be very political in a sense that its utopian desire encourages the reader's political desire to reimagine the existing forms of nationalism. Those are my three questions for Dr. Kim. That's it. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다, 선생님. 그 발표자 선생님을 뒤에 놓고 저는 지금 화면을 보고 있는데 선생님 뒤에 놓으시고 토론을 하시려니 굉장히 어색하실 것 같습니다. 질문 우리 자료집에 있는 질문에서 세 번째 건 빼셨어요?
예, 세 번째는 뺐습니다.
예,
I skipped the third one, Dr. Kim.
그래서 세 가지 질문에 대한 답변을 간단히 듣겠습니다. 데니얼 김 선생님, 답변 부탁드립니다.
First of all, thank you so much for those great questions. I very much appreciate it. 감사합니다. The first question, yes, this was originally part of my book, Intimacies of Conflict. So in the book, the first part of it looks at U.S. Popular culture from the 1950s, and the second part I look at various novels, mostly from the U.S. But originally I had paired this novel with Juan Santiago's The Guest. And I was very interested in the way that those two novels sort of illuminated the history, the complex history of Christianity, which is an aspect of South Korean history that Americans don't know anything about this stuff. So I was, you know, in relation to that audience, I found these novels incredibly useful historiographically. So that was the project that was there. But the book was too long, so I had to cut something, and this was the casualty. This was the collateral damage that had to come out to make the book fit. And there's an allusion, and this book preceded an analysis of the War Memorial of Korea. And one of the essays that I mentioned by Sheila Mayoshi Jagger sort of talks about how the original version of that War Memorial codified a post-Cold War narrative of the war, in which the war was described more as a tragedy that befell the Korean people rather than the sort of Cold War narrative that just vilified North Koreans. So the project overall is historiographical, and the question I was grappling with was like how, well, there are two novels, this novel and Shangri-La's The Surrender. When you first read them, they both seem anti-historical, so it was my struggle to figure out how to situate those novels historically, while honoring the ways in which the novels are trying to work against that. So that was, you know, that's the sort of dance that I was trying to capture. And your second question about Shin's.
Okay,
Oh,
Dr. Kim,
Oh,
just a moment, please. Can I just interpret what you have just said to the audience for a second?
Sure.
Very shortly. 김 교수님께서 그 Intimacies of Conflict라는 그 책에 이제 1950년대 미국 대중문화를 이제 좀 연구를 하셨는데, 그쪽에 이제 한국 그 전쟁에 대한 이제 재현이나 이런 것들에 대해서 관심을 이제 가지시게 됐고, 이제 그러한 재현의 방식에서 이제 그 굉장히 좀 이제 안티커뮤니즘적이고 그리고 기독교와 관련된 그러한 역사적인 내용들이 굉장히 많이 있었다고 하시네요. 그래서 이제 그것과 관련해서 관심을 더 가지게 되니까 이러한 그 리처드 그 김은국의 순교자라든지 그리고 이창래의 The Surrender와 같은 이제 작품들을 또 관심을 가지시게 되었다고 합니다. 그리고 이제 그와 더불어서 이제 그 전쟁 기념에 이제 또 이렇게 표현이 되어 있는 이 전쟁에 대한 재현 이런 것들이 이제 콜드워 냉전에 대해서 이제 특히 이제 공산주의에 대해서 굉장한 이제 빌리파이를 하는 이렇게 악마한다는 할까요? 이제 그런 어떤 이제 재현의 방식 이러한 것들 말고 좀 이제 좀 다른 어떤 방식이 있는 게 아닌가라는 어떤 시도에서 이 작품은 이제 자기에 대한 비판이기도 하고 그러니까 이제 스스로 김은국이 속한 그 공동체에 대한 이제 비판이기도 한 것이죠. 그래서 이제 그런 이제 작품들을 일종의 이제 역사적인 이제 관점에서 접근. 왜냐하면 이제 기존의 이런 작품들은 그런 역사적인 관점이 아니라 굉장히 실존주의적인 그런 좀 보편적 철학적 관점에서 많이 이제 접근이 되어져서 그런 쪽으로 이렇게 연구를 하시고 계시다고 합니다.
네, 계속해 주시죠, 데니얼 선생님. 네.
Thank you. As far as your second question, I agree that Shin, in going along with the lie, ends up supporting South Korean propaganda, and I think so. I'm not claiming that he's resisting. You know, I think what we see is the sort of the collision between the sort of political motivations of the state versus the suffering of the people. And where he's situated, he feels like, I think he just has, for him to expose the martyrs' loss of faith would hurt the state, but it would also hurt the people. And so the way in which that difficult alliance is there is I think, is something the novel presents as a problem, if that makes sense. So I think the novel is always making you aware how the state corrupts Christianity and makes it serve its purposes, but it leaves a space open for ordinary Koreans who have this, I guess you could say, naive faith, but they need it to survive emotionally. And the perverse heroism of Shin, who can't take comfort from the very thing he gives to the congregants. I think that's what's so moving and tragic about the situation.
네, 리처드 김의 이 소설에서 이제 이런 신목사가 12 살해된 그 목사가 순교자들이었다라고 이제 거짓 증언을 하게 된 그것이 이 국가의 이데올로기적인 정치적인 목적에 복무한다라는 것, 그 부분에 대해서 이제 선생님께서도 인정을 하시고, 그런데 이제 그것을 소설이 하나의 문제로서 계속 제시하고 있다. 어떻게 이제 국가가 종교를 계속 이제 그 국가의 목적을 위해서 복무하게끔 그렇게 만드는가, 이런 것들을 계속 이제 인식을 하고 읽게끔 이제 독자들을 이제 유도를 하는 것이고, 그렇지만 그럼에도 불구하고 이제 신이 이제 보여주는 그러한 거짓 증언은 이 일반 그 신자들이 유지할 필요가 있는 생존에 필요가 있는 그러한 어떤 믿음, 어떤 순수한 어떤 그런 믿음의 형태, 이제 이러한 것이 필요함을 이제 강조하고 있는. 그래서 이제 시는 이제 거기에서 이제 일종의 분열이 되었다고 할 수 있는데, 이 일반 평신도 이제 국민들을 위한 이제 선택을 했다고 할 수가 있는 것이죠.
Your third question, I think, is related to the second question, and I guess it's something I'm trying to figure out how to talk about myself, or I guess the other way to put it is I'm interested in how artists are grappling with this problem. Another writer that I'm interested in is Dami Che, who is a poet. I don't know how well known she is in Korea, but she's a very experimental poet. But her works are Hardly War and DMZ Colony. And I'm very interested in her work because I think she plays with affect in a similar, there's something interesting about how they manipulate affect or seek to make you feel very intensely, but in ways that are also troubling and that also try to make you critical of state power and state-sponsored versions of nationalism. But of course, the danger that you're pointing out is always there, which is that any version of nationalism can be co-opted or absorbed by a state. So that's the thing I'm trying to puzzle through, or I'm trying to trace how different writers contend with that. And underneath, or like circling around, is the term Han, which I'm very ambivalent about. But you could read that final passage in the Kim as an evocation of Han, right? And that is a term that I think it has a lot of ideological baggage with it as well. But maybe I think the novel is trying to explore versions of that kind of affect that would sort of that would enlist nationalists feeling against state nationalism and against the political as it exists in either part of the division system. But again, it's utopian, you know, so it has all the limitations of being utopian. It can't actually, once it's embodied, then it no longer exists as utopian. And so that's you put your finger exactly on the problem, I think, that the novel ends with.
Okay. So who's the poet's name that you mentioned?
Oh, I'll put it in the chat.
In the chat? Yes, please.
Oh, sorry.
최다미? 최동미? Yeah, I can see it. I can see it.
돈미?
Yeah, her father was a photographer, and he documented like the institution of martial law of Baekjang-hee. He was a sort of prominent photojournalist. He also documented the Korean soldiers who went to Vietnam. And so she has an interesting version of a daughter narrative where the connection is not to the connection is to very troubled political history.
I see.
And what it means to be a witness to that history.
Okay. 최동미 시인을 이제 소개해 주시면서 이 마지막 이제 질문에 대해서 답변을 주셨는데요. 이 시인이 이제 굉장히 이제 실험적인 시인이고, 그리고 이제 뭐 DMZ와 같은 이런 한국 전쟁과 관련된 이 어떤 그 장소 이런 데에 이제 관련돼 있는 좀 정동, 에펙트 같은 경우, 그래서 이제 다양한 어떤 감정적인 측면들을 다루는 시를 이제 많이 쓰고, 그 아버지는 이제 그 저널 포토그래퍼, 이제 사진 그 작가로 베트남전이라든지 이제 박정희 정권에 대해서 이제 다큐멘터리적인 그런 이제 작품을 많이 남기신 분이라고 합니다. 그래서 이제 우리가 이제 이러한 전쟁이나 전쟁과 관련된 장소에서 어떤 이제 강렬한 감정을 느끼는가, 그리고 그것과 동시에 이 최동미 시인은 이제 국가가 주도하는 스테이트 내셔널, 국가가 주도하는 국가주의, 내셔널리즘, 이제 여기에 대해서 이제 또 이제 비판적인 이제 그 에펙트를 이제 가지도록 하는 어떤 그런 이제 시나 이런 것들을 많이 이제 썼다고 하는데, 이제 그런 부분을 이제 이 마지막 소설의 마지막에서 이제 이대희가 그 피난민들이 이제 그 홈랜드, 솔로 홈랜드 이 노래를 부르는 그쪽으로 이렇게 가는 장면이거든요. 그래서 그 장면에서 이제 그 김 교수님께서는 좀 여러 아주 많은 복잡한 이 에펙트라고 할 수 있는 우리나라의 그 약간 한의 정서가 아닌가 이렇게 제안을 하시면서, 이제 그 한의 정서라는 것은 이제 이러한 뭐 공산주의든 이제 반공산주의든 어떤 국가적인 형태를 취하고 있는 그런 이제 국가가 이제 이미 보여주고 있는 그러한 국가주의에 대해서 이제 언제나 이 반하는 이제 그런 어떤 의미에서 이제 선생님께서 보셨다. 그래서 이제 이게 유토피안적이다. 존재하지 않는, 이미 이제 국가가 그거를 담지하게 된다면 이제 그것은 이제 선생님께서 말하는 그런 센티멘탈한 내셔널리즘과는 이제 다른 형태다라고 답변을 주셨습니다.
네, 감사합니다. 시간은 다 됐지만 실은 선생님께서 이선전 선생님께서 그 발표자 선생님의 답변까지도 통역을 해주시는 수고를 해주셨기 때문에 잠시 선물을 드리자면 그 답변에 대한 선생님의 견해는 어떠신지 다시 말씀하실 시간을 드리겠습니다.
Well, do I have to say what in English or
데니엘 킴 선생님도 들으시는 게 좋으니까 영어로 하셔.
Well, you kind of guess this song, lyrical song, is national Korean anthem, right?
It doesn't say.
It doesn't say, but you kind of guess, right? Is that your guess or?
I think the line is, a song, singing a song in homage to their country, but so it could be Aridan. It never says, and I think that's the point. Like, that's the utopian. Melody is wordless, right?
Yes.
And that's why melody can be utopian, because once you add words, then it's not utopian anymore. Then it's a specific nation state that gets invoked. Does that
Right.
make sense? I
Yeah,
mean, that's how
that
I
makes
read it.
sense. So, in a translated version of your paper, I mean, the translator translated that specific phrase into 고향의 노래. Yeah. So
Yeah,
it's,
in English, it's ambiguous.
yeah, yes, it's really ambiguous. So it depends on who translates this phrase, these phrases. So there are four
Yeah.
versions. So there are four versions of translation of this novel.
Oh, in Korean.
Yeah, into Korean,
Yes.
including Richard Gibbs' own translation too. So as far as I know, among the four versions, three versions translated this phrase into national anthem kind of thing.
Yeah, that's it.
So definitely there's this nationalist undercurrent in this part. So people, I think, tend to read this passage from a nationalist perspective, not a sentimentalist nationalist perspective as you propose. So because I think the whole novel, I think it's kind of gestures toward this, nationalist sentiment, by showing Shin's kind of timid or ambivalent attitude toward this state power.
Yes. Yes, and I would add, I mean, I'm very curious. Professor Kim Yosil said that she wrote about the film adaptation, which I'm not
Yes.
aware of. So so Professor, I would love if you could email me your comments, and if Professor Kim could email me her paper, I could get something translated, because I'm very curious about
Right.
his so in Korea, people read his work.
Pardon me?
Korean readers read the Martyred.
Yes. So there are
It's
four
well known.
translations.
Four translations. That's very interesting. I would love to, in relation to the transnational context, I would be curious to see how it's received. Because I agree that there's a way to read this novel as nationalist in that way.
Uh-huh.
But U.S. critics have tended to read it as American nationalist. That this is a sort of story about why he leaves Korea.
I see.
Right?
Yeah.
So that the ending for them, for Josephine Park and for Christine Hong, is this is sort of, he feels lighthearted because he's leaving this country.
I see. Yeah. I see the point.
And because that's what Richard Kim does, right? And he goes to the United States, becomes a U.S. citizen. So, it's literature, so it has this ambiguity to it and
Sure.
conflicting interpretations. But for me, the decisive thing is when you go read that essay, Kareem, that he wrote for the Atlantic magazine. He's very critical of Park Chung-hee,
Yep.
like in ways that makes him sound almost like Bruce Cummings.
Mhm.
Like it's a very left perspective, and it doesn't line up exactly with the novel. But if you start to put them together, then you see elements of the novel that go that way.
Okay. Thank you.
예, 죄송하지만 네 선생님 지금 두 분이서 말씀 나누신 거를 아주 간단하게 한 문장으로 그 네 가지 번역 버전 중에서 이 내셔널리스틱한 거를 내셔널 안템으로 번역하는 그런 그러니까 한국에서의 그 경향과 데니엘 교수님의 그 해석이 조금 차이가 나는 부분, 그런 모호성 이런 것에 대해서 이야기를 하셨고, 영화 버전 순교자에 대해서도 얘기가 잠깐 나왔었습니다.
네.
간단하게
그래서
정리해 주시고 마무리해야 될 것 같습니다.
이제 미국의 경우에는 이제 이 책을 이제 아메리칸 내셔널리스트의 관점에서, 그래서 이제 김은국이 미국으로 가서 미국 시민이 된 것, 이런 것들 이제 이 전쟁이 있는 이 이데올로기전, 이 전쟁을 벗어나는 어떤 그러한 이제 관점에서, 미국적인 관점에서 이제 읽고 있는 부분이 있다고 이제 하셨습니다. 그래서 이제 김여신 선생님이 이제 연구를 하신 이 영화 버전에 대해서도 이제 궁금하시다고 해주십니다.
네, 감사합니다. 할 얘기가 더 이어질 수도 있겠지만, 네, 다음 발표를 위해서 여기서 마무리하도록 하겠습니다. 그 대니엘 선생님 그리고 너무 고생 많으셨습니다.
Thank you.
감사합니다.